Imagine someone invents a new form of surgery. This new technique promises to treat a condition previously considered untreatable. Now, along with it, they also create new tools that enable one to perform this new procedure. Then they publish a research paper about it, get mentioned in the news, and tens of thousands of people find out about this great new innovation that promises to improve the lives of so many around the world. However, they keep the new tools that they created to themselves. In a case like this, how useful would you say this new technique is? Everybody finds out about it, but very few people are actually able to use it or benefit from it. Now, I think you can appreciate the fact that being protective of tools that enable new techniques will not only limit the impact these techniques can have, but also it'll prevent others from trying them out and improving upon them. And I'm here to tell you that something exactly like that is happening in science, and it's decreasing our chances of collaboratively solving some of the most important problems we face. Today, I want to talk to you about the role of openness and collaboration in science, specifically about the movement of open science, and within open science, open source. Just to introduce what open science is. Open science is the movement dedicated at making all scientific research and data openly and freely accessible to everyone. And one of the 6 core principles of open science is open source, referring to open source software. And what is open source software? It is software for which the source is made freely available to the general public for use or modification. I'm currently a PhD candidate at MIT working in computer vision, and for the last 6 years or so, I've had to use or write some type of software for my research. And I want to share with you a few things I've learned around open sharing of software in scientific research. Now, you could say that science has been open for centuries. People publish papers in journals, and anybody can read these journals, and then they can give credit to the original author by citing their paper in any follow-up publications. However, these journals aren't really open. And what I mean by that specifically is that if you ever want to read a paper in one of these scientific journals, you have to pay, often a significant amount per paper. And the worst thing is that you even have to pay to read a paper on research that was funded by your tax dollars, a portion of the $65 billion in government funding that goes to universities and colleges every year in the US. Now, fortunately, the open science movement has actually made some progress on this issue in the last few years. In fact, there's a bill in the House of Representatives right now called the Fair Access to Science and Technology Research Act, or FASTER, which would mandate the public release of publicly funded research, which will hopefully get passed and become law soon. However, this bill says nothing about the software that is created as part of these publicly funded projects. And why is that a problem? In today's day and age, where computers and software are becoming more powerful by the day, software is beginning to drive a vast majority of research out there. We live in a world where it is possible for a researcher to simulate and analyze, let's say, how a nanoparticle releases drug into the bloodstream before any actual tests are conducted on animals. And oftentimes, software exactly like this is a key enabler of any follow-up research. In addition, this software tends to be fairly large, complex, and tedious to replicate. So for example, if a researcher like me had open access to a paper about some software-driven research, I would still have to spend several months, if not years, just recreating that software before I can replicate the published results. And as a researcher, it is critical for me to be able to reproduce these results, because then only can I start building upon them. Now, this really undermines some of the key enabling qualities of software, which is one, that it's easy to distribute. 2, it produces almost the exact same result on any computer. And 3, that it can be quickly and easily updated and improved. Not to mention the potentially huge impact some open source software coming out of science can have. Consider the example of this machine learning library called scikit-learn, And some of you here actually might be familiar with this. The original paper about this has been cited over 7,000 times, which is a lot, in just 6 years. And it has enabled research across a huge variety of domains, all the way from evolutionary biology to astrophysics to psychology. It even helps power Spotify, a service that many of us use pretty much every day. Now, I want to clarify that for software that comes out of privately funded research or software that forms the basis of a new company, whether that's made open source is purely a business decision. I'm only talking about software as it's used in academic research that mostly comes out of publicly funded projects, which, if it isn't shared, mostly will just sit on a hard drive somewhere before it gets thrown out. So this culture of being protective of software that research is based on is a stumbling block and really slows down the innovation process in a lot of fields. And I can say this from my personal experience. My research has been based at the intersection of two fields which are culturally very different: computer science and mechanical engineering. Now, computer science, on one hand, as a field, has really adopted this culture of open source. There are a lot of researchers, however, in mechanical engineering who are still protective about their software, so they keep it to themselves. Access to all of this software coming from the computer science community has enabled me to make very rapid progress. However, to implement some of my ideas on the mechanical engineering side, I've had to recreate over 10,000 lines of software over almost 3 years. And I've heard repeatedly over the last 5 to 6 years from many of my colleagues at MIT, over and over again, that they needed some software to advance their research, and they were not able to gain access to it. All this for software that has been written multiple times in multiple labs as part of multiple projects, a lot of which were taxpayer funded. So perhaps we need to start thinking about another bill that would mandate the release of software also that comes out of these publicly funded projects. Now, I want to make a point that appeals to the researchers here. You guys might be wondering, well, why is it that some researchers in some of these fields feel the need to be protective like this? They publish papers openly, but why not also release software? And the answer to this question lies in the way the academic community evaluates researchers. Researchers get evaluated based on the number of papers they publish and how influential those papers are. And one of the strongest indicators of how influential a paper is how many citations it has. That is, how many other research papers make a reference to it. So researchers sometimes feel if they keep the software they create to themselves, then they will be the only ones who can publish more papers based on that software. And then more papers will translate to a better academic profile. Now, what if I were to tell you that it might actually be in a researcher's best interest to open source the software that they write? There are literally hundreds of examples of papers out there with which software was released, which are also the all-time single most cited paper of their authors, often by a significant margin. Now, citation data is not easily accessible, but even a preliminary survey tends to show that open sourcing your software can actually get you a lot of citations. And if other people find your software useful, then you become more visible in your community, and that further pushes your reputation. Plus, it's easier than ever these days to publish a paper solely about a software package through new journals, like the Journal of Open Source Software. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, making software shareable and usable takes a lot of extra time and effort. And I totally agree, it does. But it seems like the more effort you put into making your software usable, the higher the chances that it will come back and get you a bunch of citations. And consider the fact for a moment that maybe your papers aren't really complete without the software anyway, because that is preventing other researchers from rapidly reproducing your results. As I close, I'd like to ask you all to take some action to help this cause of open source in science. As researchers and the entire academic community, you should adopt the culture of open source and release the software that you write. If nothing, then for your own academic profile. This doesn't always happen, but I believe that open source is one of those few things that ensures everybody wins. And let's try and change this culture slowly, because that type of change can only come from within the community. And as citizens, you should expect and demand openness from taxpayer-funded research. This will ensure that appropriate legislation, such as FASTER, gets drafted and passed. Even if a single researcher does not have to spend months replicating software, all of your tax dollars going into research will go much further. And most importantly, this will ensure that you have the choice to access any of these publications if you ever feel the need to. So just like that surgeon who knows about a new technique but does not have access to the required tools, researchers in a lot of fields these days don't have access to the tools they need to advance their research. And these days, oftentimes, that tool is some type of software. So whenever possible, let's put the tools that surgeons and researchers need back in their hands. And let's all help advance our society to become a place where not just new techniques and discoveries, but also the tools that enable them are openly shared, so that we can not just solve problems we face, but also make amazing new discoveries together. Thank you very much.